In the autumn of 1942, a 17-year-old girl named Noor Inayat Khan stood at a crossroads that would forever alter the course of her quiet life. Born into a world of music, mysticism, and pacifist philosophy, she seemed the least likely candidate to become one of Britain's most courageous secret agents. Yet within a year, this shy writer of children's stories would be operating a clandestine radio in Nazi-occupied Paris, transmitting vital intelligence that would save countless Allied lives. Her story is not one of calculated heroism or trained expertise. It is the remarkable tale of an ordinary young woman who, through a series of extraordinary circumstances and her own unwavering moral courage, would outsmart the most sophisticated spy-hunting apparatus the Third Reich had ever created. The world Noor inhabited in 1942 was one of darkness and desperation. Nazi Germany had conquered most of continental Europe, and Britain stood as one of the last bastions of resistance against Hitler's seemingly unstoppable war machine. The Special Operations Executive, Winston Churchill's secret army tasked with setting Europe ablaze through sabotage and subversion, was desperately short of radio operators who could communicate with resistance networks in occupied France. These operators, known as pianists in the parlance of espionage, were the vital lifeline between London and the fighters on the ground. Without them, the resistance would be blind, isolated, and ultimately doomed. But being a wireless operator in occupied France was perhaps the most dangerous job in the entire war. The Gestapo and the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had deployed sophisticated radio detection equipment throughout Paris and other major cities. These direction-finding bands could triangulate a transmission within minutes, leading stormtroopers directly to the operator's door. The average life expectancy of a radio operator in France was just 6 weeks. Most were captured, tortured for information, and either executed or sent to concentration camps. It was into this deadly game of cat and mouse that Noor Inayat Khan would voluntarily walk, armed with little more than her courage, her training, and an unexpected advantage that neither she nor her superiors fully understood at the time. Noor was the daughter of an Indian Sufi mystic and an American mother, raised in a household where music, poetry, and spiritual contemplation were valued above all else. Her father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, had brought the message of Sufism to the Western world, preaching universal love, tolerance, and the unity of all religions. Noor grew up speaking multiple languages, playing the harp, and writing fairy tales for children. She had published a book of children's stories inspired by Buddhist Jataka tales, stories filled with animals who learned moral lessons through kindness and wisdom. Nothing in her background suggested she possessed the hardness, the deceptiveness, or the calculated ruthlessness that intelligence work demanded. Indeed, when she first applied to join the war effort, her assessment officers were deeply skeptical. She seemed too gentle, too emotional, too transparently honest to survive in the shadow world of espionage. Yet Noor had something that would prove more valuable than cynicism or ruthlessness. She had an unshakable sense of duty, inherited from both her father's spiritual teachings and her own fierce opposition to fascism. When France fell to Nazi occupation, Noor and her family had fled to England, barely escaping the advancing German armies. She had seen firsthand the terror that Hitler's regime brought to innocent people. She had watched refugees streaming through the streets, families torn apart, lives destroyed by the machinery of totalitarian conquest. For Noor, joining the fight against Nazi Germany was not an adventure or a career move. It was a moral imperative, a spiritual calling that transcended her natural gentleness and her family's pacifist traditions. Her father had taught her that life was sacred, but he had also taught her that evil must be resisted, that darkness must be confronted with light. The Special Operations Executive was not her first choice. Noor had initially joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, training as a wireless operator for the Royal Air Force. She proved to be an exceptionally skilled radio operator, her musical training giving her an almost instinctive feel for Morse code rhythms and frequencies. It was this skill that brought her to the attention of SOE recruiters, who were scouring every branch of the military for potential agents who could operate behind enemy lines. They needed people who spoke fluent French, who understood radio technology, and who had the courage to parachute into occupied territory knowing they would likely never return. Noor met all these criteria, but her personality profile was deeply concerning to the veteran intelligence officers who would decide her fate. The debate over whether to send Noor Inayat Khan into the field would become one of the most controversial decisions in SOE's history. Some officers saw her as a liability, too naive and too emotionally fragile for the brutal realities of clandestine warfare. Others recognized in her something that could not be taught or trained, a moral strength and determination that might prove more durable than the hardened cynicism of professional spies. In the end, desperation made the decision for them. By the summer of 1943, the entire SOE network in Paris had been compromised and destroyed by German counterintelligence operations. Every radio operator had been captured or killed. The resistance networks were in chaos, unable to communicate with London, unable to coordinate their activities or receive the supplies and instructions they desperately needed. Britain needed someone in Paris immediately, and Noor Inayat Khan, despite all the reservations about her suitability, was the only qualified French-speaking wireless operator available. On the night of June 16, 1943, Noor parachuted into occupied France under the cover name Madeleine. She carried with her a suitcase containing her radio transmitter, false identity papers, and enough courage to sustain her through what would become one of the most remarkable intelligence operations of World War II. She could not have known that she was jumping into a city where the Gestapo had perfected the art of catching secret agents, where every café might harbor an informer, where even the slightest mistake could mean death. She could not have known that within months, she would be the last surviving radio operator in Paris, single-handedly maintaining the vital communication link between London and the French resistance. And she certainly could not have known that her very unsuitability for espionage, the qualities that had made her superiors doubt her, would become the keys to her survival and her success in a deadly game where professional spies were falling like autumn leaves. The training that Noor Inayat Khan underwent in preparation for her mission into occupied France was designed to strip away civilian sensibilities and replace them with the cold calculations of a professional spy. At the SOE training schools scattered across the British countryside, recruits learned the dark arts of sabotage, silent killing, lock-picking, and deception. They were taught how to lose a tail, how to recognize surveillance, how to lie convincingly under interrogation, and how to kill quickly and quietly with their bare hands. The instructors were hardened veterans of intelligence work, men who had operated in the shadows of European cities for years, who understood that sentimentality was a luxury that got agents killed. They looked at Noor Inayat Khan and saw a problem. The assessment reports from Noor's training period make for sobering reading. One instructor wrote that she was not overburdened with brains, and was unsuitable for employment as a secret agent. Another noted that she was too emotional and impulsive, and lacked the cool detachment necessary for clandestine work. Perhaps most damning was the observation that she was too transparently honest, that her face revealed her thoughts and feelings too readily, making it nearly impossible for her to maintain a convincing cover story under pressure. There were serious discussions about washing her out of the program entirely. Some officers argued that sending Noor into the field would not only result in her own capture and death but might compromise other agents and resistance networks through her inevitable mistakes. Yet Noor persisted through every phase of training with a quiet determination that surprised even her harshest critics. She learned Morse code until she could transmit and receive messages at speeds that exceeded requirements. She memorized codes, procedures, and security protocols with meticulous attention to detail. She practiced parachute jumps until she could land safely even in difficult conditions. What she lacked in natural deceptiveness, she tried to compensate for through sheer preparation and study. She created elaborate cover stories for her fictional identity as Jean-Marie Renier, a children's nurse, and rehearsed them until she could recite every detail without hesitation. She studied maps of Paris until she knew every street, every metro station, every potential safe house and escape route. The wireless training was where Noor truly excelled. Radio operation in wartime was as much art as science. Each operator developed their own distinctive fist, a unique rhythm and pattern in how they sent Morse code, as recognizable to trained ears as a fingerprint. Noor's fist was described as unusually clean and precise, a reflection of her musical background and her natural attention to detail. More importantly, she grasped the technical aspects of radio transmission with an intuitive understanding that some operators never achieved. She learned how to quickly assemble and disassemble her equipment, how to rig improvised antennas, how to adjust frequencies to avoid German detection equipment, and how to troubleshoot technical problems in the field without support. The political and military situation Noor was being trained to enter was deteriorating rapidly. By early 1943, the Nazi occupation of France had evolved from a military conquest into a comprehensive system of surveillance, repression, and terror. The Gestapo, working closely with the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, had developed sophisticated techniques for hunting British agents and French resistance fighters. They had infiltrated resistance networks with double agents, they operated fake resistance groups to trap genuine patriots, and they had perfected the art of turning captured agents into unwitting tools against their former comrades. The radio detection vans that prowled the streets of Paris could locate a transmission with terrifying speed, and teams of specialists analyzed every intercepted message, looking for patterns, mistakes, and opportunities for deception operations. The German spy hunting apparatus was led by some of the most capable intelligence officers in the Third Reich. Joseph Kiefer, who commanded the Sicherheitsdienst in Paris, was a brilliant and ruthless operator who had personally overseen the destruction of multiple SOE networks. His men had captured dozens of British agents, and through a combination of sophisticated psychological pressure and outright torture, they had extracted enough information to roll up entire resistance circuits. Kiefer's greatest innovation was the radio game, in which captured wireless operators were forced to continue transmitting to London under German control, sending messages that appeared genuine but actually provided false information or lured additional agents into traps. By the time Noor arrived in France, the Germans had been running multiple radio games simultaneously, and SOE headquarters in London was struggling to determine which of their operators were genuine and which had been compromised. Into this nightmare scenario, Noor Inayat Khan parachuted in June 1943 as part of the Prosper Network, one of SOE's largest operations in France. The Prosper Circuit coordinated resistance activities across a vast area, organizing sabotage operations, arranging supply drops, and gathering intelligence on German military movements. But unknown to Noor or to London, Prosper had already been partially penetrated by German intelligence. Within weeks of her arrival, the entire network would collapse in a series of devastating arrests. The network's leader, Francis Suttle, would be captured. His second-in-command would be arrested. Safe houses would be raided, weapons caches discovered, and dozens of resistance fighters rounded up in a coordinated sweep that demonstrated just how thoroughly the Germans had infiltrated the organization. Noor found herself in Paris in July 1943 as the sole surviving radio operator in a network that was disintegrating around her. Other agents were going to ground, fleeing to other regions, or attempting to escape back to England. The standing orders from London were clear: if a network was compromised, agents were to cease operations and exfiltrate immediately. But Noor faced an impossible choice. If she fled, the entire resistance effort in the Paris region would be left deaf and blind, unable to communicate with London, unable to receive instructions or supplies, unable to coordinate with Allied military planning as the invasion of Europe approached. Dozens of resistance fighters would be isolated and vulnerable. Intelligence that could save lives and shorten the war would never reach Allied commanders. Against all protocol, against all her training, against the specific orders she received from London to return to England, Noor decided to stay. This decision would define everything that followed. Noor understood, perhaps better than anyone, how dangerous her situation had become. She knew the Gestapo was hunting for her. She knew that every transmission increased the risk of detection. She knew that her colleagues had been captured and were likely being tortured for information about her identity and whereabouts. She had every reason to save herself, to follow orders, to get out while escape was still possible. But she had not come to France to be safe. She had come to fight fascism, to resist evil, to do whatever was necessary to help liberate the country that had been her childhood home. In that moment of decision, the gentle, emotional, supposedly unsuitable Noor Inayat Khan revealed a core of steel that all the professional cynics had missed. She would not abandon her mission. She would not abandon the people who depended on her. She would stay in Paris and continue transmitting, no matter the cost, for as long as she possibly could. What she could not know was that her very unsuitability for espionage, the emotional honesty and unconventional thinking that had concerned her trainers, would become her greatest weapons in the deadly game she was about to play. The Paris that Noor Inayat Khan operated in during the summer and autumn of 1943 was a city transformed by occupation into something dark and paranoid. The broad boulevards and elegant cafes that had once symbolized freedom and culture now served as hunting grounds for the Gestapo and their French collaborators. Parisians lived under constant surveillance, never certain whether the person next to them in a cafe or sharing a metro car might be an informer. The Nazi swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower, German soldiers marched through the Arc de Triomphe, and the machinery of the Holocaust operated with bureaucratic efficiency from offices throughout the city. For a secret agent operating alone, every interaction was potentially fatal, every mistake could be the last. Noor established her first safe house in an apartment in the 16th arrondissement, a respectable neighborhood where a quiet young woman would not attract immediate attention. She adopted the cover identity of Jean-Marie Renier, supposedly a children's nurse, though she rarely socialized enough for anyone to question her background in detail. Her routine became a carefully choreographed dance of survival and espionage. She would scout locations for transmitting, looking for buildings with good sight lines that would allow her to spot German detection vans approaching. She developed a network of temporary transmission sites, never using the same location twice in succession, moving constantly to stay ahead of the German direction-finding equipment that was sweeping the city day and night. The technical challenge of operating a clandestine radio in occupied Paris cannot be overstated. Noor's transmitter was a Mark II suitcase radio, a compact but powerful device that could communicate with England despite the distance and atmospheric interference. But every time she transmitted, she was essentially lighting a beacon that German detection equipment could home in on. The longer she transmitted, the more accurate the German direction finding became. A typical message required 15 to 20 minutes to encode, transmit, receive a reply, and decode. During those precious minutes, Noor had to maintain her position while German vans triangulated her location, racing against time to complete the transmission before they arrived. She developed an almost supernatural sense of timing, somehow knowing when she had stayed on the air too long, when it was time to pack up her equipment and disappear into the crowds. The content of Noor's transmissions was vital to the Allied war effort in ways that would only become fully apparent later. She passed along intelligence about German troop movements, information about new defensive positions being constructed along the French coast, details about railway schedules and military supply shipments, and reports from resistance groups about targets for sabotage operations. This information fed directly into Allied planning for the coming invasion of Normandy. RAF bombing raids were planned based on intelligence that Noor transmitted. Resistance groups received instructions and coordination through her radio link. Weapons drops were arranged, escape lines for downed Allied airmen were maintained, and strategic assessments of German strength and readiness flowed back to London through her tireless work. But Noor was not simply a passive relay station. As the last functioning operator in Paris, she had to make decisions that would normally have been handled by a circuit organizer or a more senior agent. She had to assess the reliability of the resistance contacts who brought her intelligence, determine which information was urgent enough to risk a transmission, and coordinate between different resistance groups that were often unaware of each other's existence. She was, in effect, running an entire intelligence network single-handedly, a responsibility that no wireless operator was supposed to bear. The mental and emotional strain was enormous. She lived in constant fear of capture, knowing that German radio detection teams were hunting her specifically, that informants might recognize her, that a moment of carelessness could end everything. The Germans were indeed hunting her with increasing desperation and sophistication. Joseph Kiefer, the Sicherheitsdienst commander, had become personally obsessed with capturing the elusive British radio operator who seemed to change locations constantly, who appeared and disappeared like a ghost. His men had come close several times, arriving at transmission sites minutes after Noor had departed, finding traces of antenna wire or evidence that someone had been broadcasting from an upper floor. The direction-finding vans plotted her movements across Paris, creating a map of her operational area that steadily narrowed the search. Kiefer ordered increased surveillance in the neighborhoods where she seemed to operate most frequently. He had his men question building concierges, investigate strangers, and monitor anyone who seemed to be carrying heavy suitcases or behaving suspiciously. What Kiefer and his men did not understand, what they could not comprehend through their lens of professional espionage, was that Noor's very amateurishness was protecting her. Professional agents operated according to established patterns and procedures. They created elaborate cover identities, they socialized to blend in, they maintained regular schedules that mimic normal civilian life. Noor did none of these things in the expected ways. She was genuinely anxious and withdrawn, which made her seem like one of thousands of frightened Parisians trying to avoid attention. She moved erratically because she was constantly afraid, not following the logical patterns that a trained agent would use. She trusted her instincts and emotions in ways that professional spies had been trained to suppress, and paradoxically, those instincts often steered her away from danger that a more methodical approach might have walked directly into. There was also the matter of her appearance and background. The Gestapo was primarily looking for agents who fit certain profiles: tough, capable, professional operatives who could blend seamlessly into French society. Noor, with her Indian-American heritage, her gentle demeanor, and her visible anxiety, simply did not match their expectations of what a British secret agent looked like. Several times, German soldiers or French police stopped her on the street or questioned her in cafes. Each time, her transparent nervousness, which her training officers had viewed as a fatal flaw, actually convinced the questioners that she was exactly what she appeared to be, a frightened civilian trying to survive the occupation. They let her go, never imagining that this nervous young woman was the radio operator they were desperately seeking. London was aware of how dangerous Noor's situation had become. They sent repeated messages ordering her to cease operations and return to England. They arranged for pickup operations, planes that would land in fields outside Paris to exfiltrate her. Each time, Noor refused. She transmitted back that she understood the risks but believed her work was too important to abandon. She reported that resistance networks were still depending on her communications, that intelligence was still flowing, that she could continue operating if London would trust her judgment. It was an extraordinary assertion of autonomy from an agent who was supposed to follow orders without question. Some officers in London viewed it as insubordination. Others recognized it as a form of courage that transcended normal military discipline. As summer turned to autumn, Noor developed new techniques for evading detection. She began transmitting in shorter bursts, sometimes breaking a single message into multiple transmissions from different locations hours apart. She experimented with varying her transmission times, avoiding predictable schedules that the Germans could anticipate. She established a network of trusted contacts who would serve as lookouts, watching for German detection vans while she broadcast. She even began to study the patterns of German radio security patrols, learning their schedules and routes so she could transmit when they were least likely to be in her area. In doing so, she was reinventing the art of clandestine radio operation through trial, error, and sheer necessity. But as the weeks stretched into months, the isolation and strain began to take their toll. Noor had no one she could truly confide in, no fellow agents to share the burden with, no respite from the constant tension and fear. She kept a diary, against all protocols and security regulations, writing down her thoughts and experiences in a notebook that she carried with her. The diary entries reveal a young woman struggling to maintain her sanity and her sense of purpose in the face of overwhelming danger. She wrote about missing her family, about the beauty of Paris despite the occupation, about her determination to see the mission through no matter what happened. She wrote prayers and reflections inspired by her father's Sufi teachings, seeking spiritual strength to sustain her through the darkness. The diary was a security risk, but it was also perhaps the only thing that kept her grounded as the hunt for her intensified and the walls slowly began to close in. By October 1943, Noor Inayat Khan had been operating in Paris for more than 4 months, far longer than anyone had thought possible. She had transmitted hundreds of messages, coordinated dozens of operations, and kept the vital communication link between London and the French resistance alive through sheer determination and increasingly desperate improvisation. But the Gestapo's net was tightening with methodical precision. Joseph Kiefer's radio detection teams had narrowed the search area considerably, and a combination of technical surveillance and human intelligence was bringing them ever closer to their elusive target. The question was no longer whether Noor would be caught, but when, and whether she would realize the danger in time to escape. The threat came not from superior German technology or brilliant counterintelligence work, but from the most mundane and unpredictable source: human betrayal. A Frenchwoman named Renée Gary, who had been peripherally connected to one of the resistance networks, had become an informant for the Gestapo. Her motivations remain murky even today, some combination of fear, greed, and the desire to protect her own family by cooperating with the occupation authorities. Through a series of connections and observations, Gary had identified a suspicious young woman who seemed to be moving frequently between different apartments, carrying heavy luggage, and avoiding the routine patterns of normal Parisian life. She reported her suspicions to her Gestapo handlers, providing a physical description and information about the neighborhoods where this woman had been spotted. The description matched intelligence the Germans had already compiled about the mystery radio operator. Kiefer ordered intensive surveillance of the areas Gary had identified. His men began watching apartment buildings, noting everyone who entered and left, paying particular attention to young women carrying suitcases. They questioned concierges and neighbors, gradually building a picture of Noor's movements and habits. In the second week of October, Gary positively identified Noor entering an apartment building in the Parisian suburbs. She notified her Gestapo contact immediately, and Kiefer ordered his arrest team to prepare for a raid. After months of searching, they finally had their target. On October 13, 1943, Gestapo officers surrounded the apartment building where Noor was staying. They positioned men at all exits, ensuring there would be no escape. Then, in the early afternoon when they calculated she would most likely be present, they moved in. The arrest itself was anticlimactic in its swiftness. Noor answered the knock on her door, perhaps expecting a contact or believing she could maintain her cover identity. Instead, she found herself facing armed Gestapo officers who pushed past her into the apartment. They found her radio equipment set up and ready for transmission, her codes, her false identity papers, and most damaging of all, her personal diary with its detailed account of her activities and contacts. What happened next would become the subject of various, sometimes contradictory accounts, but the essential facts are clear. Noor did not go quietly into captivity. Despite her gentle nature and her lack of physical combat training, she fought her captors with a fury that surprised them. She attempted to escape through a window, scratched and kicked at the officers restraining her, and even managed briefly to break free and run before being recaptured. Her resistance was futile but ferocious, the actions of someone who knew exactly what capture meant and was determined to deny her enemies an easy victory. The Gestapo officers who subdued her would later describe her as fierce and dangerous, adjectives that no one who had known Noor in her peaceful pre-war life would have imagined applying to her. The immediate aftermath of Noor's capture represented a critical moment in the German intelligence war against SOE. Standard procedure for captured agents involved sophisticated interrogation designed to extract every possible piece of information: names of contacts, locations of safe houses, communication procedures, codes, and details about other operations. The Germans were skilled at this work, using a combination of psychological pressure, physical coercion, and carefully crafted deceptions to break down an agent's resistance. Most agents, even those who had seemed strong during training, eventually provided some information under these conditions. The hope was always to hold out long enough for contacts to go to ground and procedures to be changed, but complete silence was nearly impossible to maintain. Noor's response to interrogation would demonstrate the same unexpected strength she had shown throughout her mission. Despite the detailed diary the Germans had captured, which provided them with significant intelligence about her activities, she refused to answer questions about her network, her contacts, or her operations. When interrogators told her that cooperation would lead to better treatment, she remained silent. When they threatened her with torture and execution, she did not waver. The emotional transparency that had concerned her training officers, the inability to lie convincingly that had been cited as evidence of her unsuitability for espionage, now manifested as an absolute refusal to engage in the interrogation process at all. She would not play their games, would not be manipulated by their psychological techniques, because she had nothing to prove and nothing to gain by talking. Joseph Kiefer recognized that he had captured someone unusual. Most agents, when faced with the evidence of their own diaries and equipment, attempted to minimize the damage by providing limited information in hopes of protecting their most sensitive contacts. Noor simply refused to participate in that calculation. She admitted nothing beyond what the physical evidence already proved. She would not confirm or deny any specific operations. She would not discuss her training, her mission parameters, or her connections to London. Her interrogators found themselves facing someone who had transcended normal fear, who seemed to have made a decision about what she would and would not do and would not be moved from that position regardless of threats or inducements. This absolute resistance led to a decision that was unusual for high-value intelligence prisoners. Unable to extract information through interrogation, unwilling to execute her immediately while she still might provide useful intelligence, the Germans classified Noor as highly dangerous and ordered her held under maximum security conditions. She was placed in chains, kept in solitary confinement, and subjected to conditions normally reserved for the most violent and escape-prone prisoners. The Germans' own assessment of Noor had shifted dramatically. The woman they had been hunting was no longer seen as a mere radio operator or intelligence asset. She had become, in their eyes, something far more threatening, a fanatic, someone whose commitment to her cause could not be broken by normal means. Noor made 2 attempts to escape from German custody, both ultimately unsuccessful, but both demonstrating a determination that continued to surprise her captors. The first attempt, made in concert with 2 other imprisoned SOE agents, involved removing a skylight and attempting to traverse the rooftops of the building where they were held. They were caught before they could get far, but the audacity of the attempt led to even stricter security measures. The second escape attempt involved weeks of patient work loosening the bars on her cell window, work she had to conduct in absolute silence to avoid detection. Again she was caught, and this time the Germans decided that no ordinary prison could hold her. In November 1943, Noor Inayat Khan was transferred to Pforzheim prison in Germany, where she would be held in chains and solitary confinement for the next 10 months. The question of whether Noor had outsmarted German spies during her time in Paris must be understood in context. She had not defeated them through superior tradecraft, clever deceptions, or brilliant operational security. She had survived as long as she did partly through luck, partly through her unexpected unpredictability, and partly because her very unsuited for espionage made her difficult for the Germans to identify and track using their normal methods. But in the final analysis, she had accomplished her mission. She had maintained communications between London and the French resistance for months after every other operator had been captured or killed. She had transmitted vital intelligence that contributed to Allied operations and planning. And when finally captured, she had given the Germans nothing they could use to roll up other networks or capture other agents. In the ruthless calculus of intelligence warfare, her mission had been a success, even if the personal cost would prove to be total. The final chapter of Noor Inayat Khan's life played out far from the streets of Paris, where she had conducted her solitary war against Nazi Germany. Pforzheim prison, where she was held from November 1943 until September 1944, was a grim fortress designed to break the spirits of political prisoners. Noor was held in conditions of extreme isolation and hardship, chained hand and foot, denied contact with other prisoners, subjected to frequent interrogations that continued to yield nothing of value to her captors. The guards who watched over her reported that despite these brutal conditions, she never complained, never showed signs of breaking down, and maintained a quiet dignity that disturbed even her jailers. She had found within herself a core of spiritual strength that the physical degradations of prison could not touch. Throughout her captivity, German intelligence officers continued to hope that time and suffering would accomplish what interrogation had not. They brought her offers of better treatment in exchange for cooperation. They showed her captured documents to try to convince her that her networks had already been compromised, and her silence was pointless. They employed various psychological techniques designed to make her feel isolated, abandoned, and forgotten. None of it worked. Noor seems to have understood that her only remaining act of resistance was her refusal to give her enemies anything they could use. Having lost her freedom and facing almost certain death, this refusal became her final mission, one she pursued with the same determination she had shown operating her radio in occupied Paris. In September 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France and the liberation of Paris became reality, the Nazi High Command issued orders regarding the disposition of certain high-security prisoners. Noor Inayat Khan, along with 3 other female SOE agents, Yolanda Beekman, Elaine Pluman, and Madeleine Damerment, was transferred from Pforzheim to Dachau concentration camp. The 4 women were transported in the pre-dawn hours of September 11, 1944, arriving at Dachau later that day. They were immediately taken to the execution area near the crematorium. According to German records and witness testimony compiled after the war, each woman was forced to kneel, and each was shot through the back of the head. Their bodies were cremated immediately. Noor Inayat Khan was 29 years old. Her last word, according to one witness, was "Liberté." The immediate aftermath of the war revealed the full extent of what Noor and her fellow agents had accomplished and endured. As Allied investigators pieced together the story of SOE operations in France, the scale of the intelligence war that had raged beneath the surface became clear. The radio transmissions that Noor had maintained during those critical months had provided intelligence that contributed to the planning of D-Day, the coordination of resistance activities during the Normandy invasion, and the ultimate liberation of France. The information she had refused to provide under interrogation had protected dozens of resistance fighters and other agents, preventing the Germans from inflicting even more damage on Allied networks. Her story emerged as one of exceptional courage and sacrifice, made all the more remarkable by the fact that her superiors had initially doubted her suitability for the work. The recognition that Noor received posthumously reflected the deep respect her courage had earned, even from former enemies. In 1946, she was awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry, in recognition of her service and her conduct in captivity. The citation noted her conspicuous courage and devotion to duty, and her determination to continue her hazardous work in spite of the extreme danger to herself. In 1949, France awarded her the Croix de Guerre, honoring her contribution to the liberation of their nation. These honors were accepted by her mother, who had lost not only Noor but two of her sons who had also served in the war, a family sacrifice that reflected the broader costs of the struggle against fascism. The historical significance of Noor Inayat Khan's story extends beyond her individual bravery. Her experience challenged fundamental assumptions about what made an effective intelligence agent, and what kinds of courage mattered most in clandestine warfare. The professional intelligence officers who had doubted her suitability had been working from a model of espionage that emphasized deception, emotional detachment, and calculated ruthlessness. Noor succeeded, to the extent that success was possible in her impossible situation, through almost opposite qualities: emotional authenticity, spiritual conviction, and moral courage. She could not deceive interrogators effectively, so instead she simply refused to engage with them. She could not coldly calculate the odds and make rational decisions about when to withdraw, so instead she stayed at her post until capture became inevitable. Her very unsuitable proved, in the end, to be perfectly suited to the specific challenges she faced. The story of how this gentle writer of children's stories accidentally outsmarted German spies is not really about espionage, tradecraft, or intelligence tactics. It is about the power of moral conviction to sustain ordinary people through extraordinary trials. Noor did not set out to become a hero or to prove that she was tougher than professional spies. She set out to do what she believed was right, to resist an evil that had consumed her adopted homeland, to live up to the spiritual principles her father had taught her about the necessity of confronting darkness with light. That moral clarity gave her a kind of strength that professional training could not provide and that physical hardship could not break. The Germans never understood this because they were looking for the wrong kind of opponent. They expected to face cunning professionals who would try to outthink them. Instead, they encountered someone who had moved beyond cleverness to a realm of absolute commitment. In the decades since the war, Noor Inayat Khan has been memorialized in various ways that reflect the continuing relevance of her story. A bust of her stands in Gordon Square Gardens in London, the first memorial to an Asian woman in Britain. The Museum of the Royal Air Force includes exhibits about her service. Books, films, and documentaries have told her story to new generations. In an era increasingly conscious of diversity and inclusion, Noor has become a symbol of the many ways people from different backgrounds contributed to the defeat of fascism. Her story reminds us that courage and sacrifice were not the monopoly of any single nation, race, or gender, but were found wherever people of conscience chose to resist tyranny. The legacy of Noor Inayat Khan speaks to fundamental questions about human nature and the possibilities of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. She was, by any objective measure, unsuited for the work she undertook. She lacked the temperament, the training, and the cynicism that espionage seemed to demand. She should have failed quickly and perhaps should never have been sent into the field at all. Yet when circumstances demanded it, she found within herself reserves of courage and endurance that no one, including herself, had known were there. She did not outsmart German spies through superior intelligence or better tradecraft. She outlasted them through sheer force of will and moral conviction, maintaining her mission until capture became unavoidable and then refusing to betray her cause even when all was lost. As the smoke cleared over Europe in 1945 and the full horror of the Nazi regime became apparent, Noor's sacrifice took on additional meaning. She had died in a concentration camp, one of millions of victims of a totalitarian system that had sought to extinguish human dignity and freedom. But she had died unbroken, having given the Germans nothing, having maintained her principles and her courage to the very end. In a war that produced countless acts of heroism and sacrifice, her story stands out not because she achieved some impossible military victory, but because she demonstrated that the human spirit, when rooted in genuine conviction and moral purpose, could not be defeated by torture, imprisonment, or even death. The girl who seemed too gentle for espionage proved to be stronger than the machinery of Nazi terror. That is the real story of how she outsmarted German spies, not through cleverness or deception, but through a form of courage that transcended the game of espionage entirely and entered the realm of the eternal human struggle between good and evil, between light and darkness.